I'm going to take a few minutes now and go down with each of the witnesses and ask a couple of questions. Ms. Hamilton, tell me a little bit more about your contract. You spoke briefly about the services that you were providing. Could you go down that list again of what you were actually doing under your contract?
Sure, absolutely. What we do is we perform professional qualification evaluation of merchant mariner credential applications and safety and suitability screening of these applications as well. So basically, the criteria is established by the Coast Guard, and we simply administer. It's routine and administrative function in nature. SAC does not, it's not involved in any exercise of government discretion, so it's just administrative.
So it was a personnel-based.
It's personnel services, yes.
And I guess my question, Ms. Simon, you talked about the horror stories. The horror stories were either contracts that have been canceled or contracts that were or that were performing inherently or near inherently governmental functions. I guess my question to you is, what she just described, does that raise your eyebrows as to whether or not it's inherently governmental?
If Ms. Hamilton says that she learned from the agency that the work had never been categorized under a Fair Act inventory or otherwise as inherently governmental, I have no reason to doubt the truthfulness of her statement. Whether or not it's closely associated with inherently governmental work is really a judgment that's inherently governmental. I think that's for the agency to decide. You know, it's not really, I'm absolutely a layperson when it comes to these kinds of distinctions, but there are people in the agencies who are much more knowledgeable about the integration of the work of the agency and are in much better position to judge when work is a critical function for an agency or whether it's closely associated with inherently governmental.
Ms. Simon, give me a few examples of what wouldn't raise your eyebrows, of something that to you is absolutely non-inherently government.
Well, I'd be happy to answer that question, but just I want to put my answer in a little bit of context. I'm sorry that Mr. Landry left because, you know, one of the arguments that contractors, the most compelling arguments that contractors have, I believe, made in their own favor is that they're essentially disposable. You can hire contractors for temporary needs, for surge situations, but not necessarily for ongoing functions that are core to the mission of an agency. And I think this concept that once a contract is let to a contractor, the contractor has some kind of a fundamental right to a continuation of that work in perpetuity is just seems to be certainly counter to everything I know about the free enterprise system and what people can expect from their government. There are jobs that are you know, commercial in nature and that you know,
what would some of those be in your mind?
I think that, well, I guess the rule that I personally use when I analyze this kind of issue, I look at a business, and if a business has 100% of its work is government work, that makes me think that business might be inherently governmental.
If I was the food service,
absolutely no customers outside of the government, and that there is not that good or service is never exchanged solely in the private sector.
If I was the food service provider in this building, and that was 100% of my business, so 100% of my business was providing services to the government, would you consider that to be inherently governmental or commercial?
I'll tell you a food service function that I do think is inherently governmental, and that's the food service in a VA hospital. And that has been inappropriately contracted out in far too many cases.
Why is the food service in a VA hospital inherently governmental?
The veterans for overwhelming majority of the employees of the VA who do provide food service are veterans themselves, and providing, you know, veterans who are in a VA hospital are acutely ill, of course, and they often have very special dietary needs. And the integration of food service is actually very highly integrated with patient care in a VA hospital, and it is part of the internal functioning of the holistic care of a veteran who's in the hospital. And often what's happened when food service has been contracted out solely for cost reasons is people get inappropriate meals that might have food or additives in their meals that are actually counteract the effectiveness of the drug regimen they might be on, or that they're only available certain hours, and so people are forced to have frozen meals that are, not, that also vary from either their taste or the regimen that they've been placed on by their healthcare providers.
Isn't food service provided commercially?
Is a great example. Is food service provided commercially
at every hospital other than VA hospitals in this country?
Of course it is, but I think that other hospitals, private hospitals, don't outsource their food service.
I'm sorry, what?
Private hospitals don't outsource their food service to patients. Selling a hamburger to visitors, sure, that's commercial.
Okay. You mentioned before, Ms. Simon, that to your knowledge that it was only the DOD that was doing this on cost basis. I think you said they're the only ones that had come up with the actual rules, and that to our knowledge there were other.
To my knowledge, yes.
Yeah. Who was your contract with, Ms. Hamilton?
The Coast Guard.
And the Coast Guard falls under what agency?
Department of Homeland Security.
Ms. Carroll, your contract was with whom?
Our Air Force One with the Department of Labor.
Department of Labor. Is that under the Department of Defense?
No.
Is it fair to say then that in the real world what's actually happening is there are other agencies other than the Department of Defense that are doing this supposedly based on cost? Okay. Ms. Carroll, tell me a little bit more about the Department of Labor contract that you had. You didn't get a chance to talk about the specific examples, and I do think the specific examples are real. In fact, the reason we're having this hearing is because I was approached by somebody who went through something that was very similar to what you folks had gone through. It was a map maker, a cartographer who showed up at work one day to find out that he had been insourced and that all of his employees had been hired by the Federal Government. And when he inquired as to whether or not the employees were willing to do that, he was informed that they were actually getting paid 20% premium to go to work for the government over what he was paying for them. And it was in large part that experience that drove this hearing today. So I think the individual experiences are real. And Ms. Carroll, I'll be curious to know yours.
In the Department of Labor, as I said in my testimony, we were not the prime. We were a sub. We were working with a minority business. We had been in that library a number of years before, so we knew the library. And they just said, a lot of the things we're hearing today come down to way contracts are managed. I totally agree. That's what someone said. The problem is that the government has to step up and manage these contracts right. When you say in a food service that, the right thing isn't served, if there are standards of performance and they're well written, then the right things will in fact be done. And I know many contractors will do the right things even though it's not written in there. Mm-hmm. So in the case of the Department of Labor, 8 weeks before the end of the contract, we were notified that the contract would not be renewed nor recompeted. We had no indication of why that would happen, except we knew that the COs, the management of that contract, the COTR, changed all the time. So they really didn't understand what was going on at all. And they somehow had the idea to pull that work in. We had 2 librarians that worked there, and 2 of the people were insourced. The rest were just laid off. They gave us no time to really prepare for that kind of an action. And since we weren't the prime, we couldn't motivate the prime to go ahead and do FOIAs and do various things. They just said, you know what, at some point it's worth just going on, and they did.
Ms. Carroll, you also mentioned something that I'm not familiar with, which is poaching. To me, that's shooting an animal that doesn't belong to you. What does it mean in your world?
Well, not necessarily shooting, but taking an animal that doesn't belong to you. How about that?
Is that the term for hiring away the employees and so forth?
Right. Yeah. You do a very extensive recruitment process. You hire people. You train them. They work, and the government comes in and suggests that this person apply for a government job. Now, there's 2 kinds of poaching. Okay, there are some contracts we know this is going to occur. We know we're going to hire people and eventually they're going to become government, and yeah, they post the jobs, but everybody knows that person is wired for that kind of a job. That's kind of voluntary. The individual has the right to choose to apply for a government job that's posted. Okay, but it's the involuntary poaching that really is very distressing. Our project manager at an Air Force base in California was told before we were told that the contract was officially going to be outsourced. Of course, there was rumblings. She was told Your job is being posted. Go and apply for it.
Do you have any idea what it paid in that particular circumstance?
No, I do not
Whether
know
it
that.
was
I
more or
could
less
get you
the same?
data on that. I don't know what GS level it was. I never did that cost comparison, but I could get it if you'd like it.
We talk about cost comparisons, and I'm going to ask Ms. Simon a question in a few minutes about some of this supposed systematic bias in the A76 process. I think you mentioned specifically about overhead. Are you convinced, Ms. Carroll, that when you do the cost, or when the departments do the cost comparisons, that they are taking into consideration all of the costs that they should when they cost the government side of things, when they cost the government option?
No, I'm not convinced that they do cover it. The problem is that government life cycle costs for employees, for benefits, are in many different pots, sometimes not even in the same organizational pot. And so I don't think it's that transparent a process. I think you'd have to go through all kinds of routes in order to really know what the full life cycle costs of these people are. On the other hand, with a contractor, it's very clear exactly what the costs are.
You and I were talking before the hearing about a circumstance with a posting overseas. Would you like to share that with the panel?
Yeah, we had a contract, U.S. Air Force Europe, USAFE, and we were doing, we were performing very well. Before the end of the contract, they decided they would not exercise the last option year, and they said they were insourcing. Unfortunately, the German labor laws and the U.S. agreement requires those people to come back to the United States, so they couldn't be directly insourced. So some of the people just were out of jobs. But what happened was very interesting, that the government never filled some of those, still hasn't, months later, still hasn't filled those positions. We are hearing through our previous project manager, who still is in Europe, that the positions are not filled, and what they're doing now is they're paying people to go on duty to Germany. Now, was this figured in the cost? I mean, what is the accountability and what is the metrics and the measurements after the fact on whether this really works? We know a couple of the positions are still vacant, which means there isn't good data for promotions, for career paths and other things. So the servicemen and women are suffering.
You raise a good question, something that I heard from all three of the panelists regarding finding out about the process. Mr. Baines, given the decision in the Hallmark case, what methods, what avenues are available to Ms. Carroll if she wants to find out how the government costed that project?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think there are any avenues at that point, because if you can't file in the Court of Federal Claims, if there's no jurisdiction there, then you can't get a protective order to look at this data. So, and the government takes the position when you ask for it under the Freedom of Information Act that it's source selection information. That's secret. So I can't tell you what the numbers were in the Hallmark case sitting here today, because they're still under a protective order, but I can tell you that when you scrutinize them, there's two aspects that are totally out of whack. One is how many people it would take to do the job internally in the government. And then two, what are the full costs of performance of those individuals? And when you look at them and scrutinize exactly what's going on and exactly what the Air Force is going to do in the future, it doesn't make any sense at all. And now, under this decision, there may not be an opportunity to even find out ever.
Ms. Simon, I'll ask you, what's wrong with making the process public? What's wrong with sharing the information with the contractors, with the public? What's wrong with granting standing to the businesses that have had their contracts terminated?
Well, I'm listening to the three panelists. All I could think of was, welcome to our world. This is the exact same situation that federal employees, only I'd say we're in an even weaker position. This is the same kind of situation that federal employees face in the outsourcing context. We still don't have standing ever to go to the Court of Federal Claims. We're allowed to be an interested party and intervene, but we can only do so when we get the information on the in-house bid, the bid that was made on our behalf, and the contractor bid after it's too late to file a protest. We are in a
certainly
complete
somebody in the
veil
government
of
has that
ignorance,
information, right?
but not us.
Who are you in that circumstance?
The employees that are losing their jobs, the employees that have.
But your counterparts to what Ms. Carroll, Ms. Hamilton do. I mean, the bosses, I guess, have access to that information, don't they?
There are designated individuals within the agency that have that information, but certainly not the people who are affected by the decision to outsource the government work. And there's effectively no appeal right, because by the time we get the information, again, through FOIA requests or the intervention of members of Congress, it's too late for us to file any kind of protest or do anything about it. We are for transparency. On the other hand, I think that be careful what you wish for. If contractors are granted the right to engage in endless litigation whenever there's any possibility of having their contract terminated, I think agencies will certainly think twice before they sign these contracts, because it certainly raises the stakes and raises the long-term costs of engaging in a contract with a private company, because you don't have the flexibility that contractors use as their best argument for themselves. If you can never terminate a contract because you no longer want to perform that function, or you'd like to compete it in another way, or bring it back in-house, and the prospect is endless litigation, why would you ever want to subject yourself to that?
I think there's a distinction. We may be using legal terms here that mean different things to different people. To me, the termination of a contract is one thing. The expiration of a contract is another. The expiration of a contract would be the ending of a contract by its own terms and is completely contemplated in the document itself. The termination of a contract is the breaking of a contract.
Yeah, I think that what Ms. Hamilton referenced was that the government didn't exercise all of its options. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
I think there has been testimony that some of the contracts discussed today were that, but other ones were actual terminations. So I guess my question to you is to try and focus here is fairly simple, which is, what is wrong with giving the managers of the private businesses the same information that the managers of the government projects have?
I think that we have no problem with the concept of notice. Notice is one thing, and the provision of all the internal costing information prior to the decision is another. And we have some misgivings about that. Notice, no problem at all.
All right, and then lastly, I do want to touch on this issue of overhead, because in my world, Ms. Simon, by the way, you're the first person I've heard in Washington, and I mean this slightly tongue-in-cheek, that has said that this place is inherently transparent and everybody understands what's going on. You may be the only person in town who believes that.
Oh, I said that with respect to federal employees, not the government as a whole.
That's right.
Certainly there's the contractor workforce.
But in regards to transparency, as a lawmaker, as someone who's ultimately called upon to sort of choose between these two things, obviously we set policy and that it gets implemented at a different level. If you present me with a private contract for Ms. Hamilton to provide the services to the United States Coast Guard that she described, I know exactly what that is going to cost. I know how long it's going to cost and what it's going to cost on a year-to-year basis. I have what in the legal world we call a liquidated sum. I know it's going to be $100,000, whatever the number is. If you come in and tell me, well, I also want to hire the same number of government employees to do that exact amount of work, I would suggest to you I have no idea how much that is going to cost, because what I'm doing now is I've got permanent workers. I don't have a short-term contract. I haven't hired contract workers to do this work. I'm actually taking federal workers and putting them to work on this particular job. You mentioned that overhead should not be counted. It strikes me that that's bizarre. No one in the private sector would ever say those words, that you can't cost overhead into what you're doing. And it just strikes me as odd that you've taken the position today that you actually know what the government is paying for these services, because I think the exact opposite tends to be the case.